All right, everyone, welcome. My name is Piper Anderson. My pronouns are she, her, they, them. I am a brown-skinned Black woman wearing teal-colored glasses, a light-colored sweatshirt, the blue chair behind me in the room. And I am coming to you all from Lene Lenape land, also known as Philadelphia. And I am really excited to see so many people have joined us for this session, including some old friends who are in the room. So this is one of the 2 practice sessions that we are offering as a part of the Abolitionist Storywork convening. The focus or the title of this one is Developing Aftercare Practices. But we'll really be talking about care more broadly across the entire sort of process of interviewing, gathering stories, whatever the context is in which you are holding space for stories or sharing your own stories and narratives, and thinking about what care looks like, both for you yourself, if you are an interviewer or a story worker, and for the narrators that you and communities that you work with as well. I'm sure that the people in this room probably all bring their own experiences and expertise. And so we're going to hopefully have some time for you all to go into breakout rooms and to kind of share a little bit of your own practices and with each other, as well as we'll be using a tool called Slido to sort of optimize engagement, getting responses to a couple of prompts that I will offer. So I'll share, to start, just a little bit about myself and how I come to this work. If you have attended any of the other sessions that we've done so far, you know that I am the anarchical Radical Imagination Fellow for the Laundromat Project, which has been such a gift. I so rarely feel like I've spent 20 years doing this work, and it's quite rare for me to have the opportunity to have the resources and the time to just sort of think and reflect on this work. Otherwise, I just feel like I'm constantly hustling, right? Like so many of us who do this. And so this past 9 months has been really a great opportunity to, reflect on the sort of intersecting threads of my work, which is cut across, storytelling and cultural organizing and transformative justice and healing justice and public memory. I've spent 2 decades, thinking about the role of stories and organizing, the ways that narrative as a relational and dialogical tool can be a strategy for repair and for justice. And so that is also demanded as a part of that work, that I think about, how do we take care of ourselves and each other in the process as well? Because if the process isn't healing, if it is not just, if it is not centering repair and restoration and recovery, then the outcome can never be as just, right? Like if we're not thinking about, if we think that like ripping ourselves open in the process is somehow going to lead to a more just world, I just don't think that that's always true, right? Damage gets done in the process, and how do we want to show up on the other side of this world that we're building, right? Broken down, right? And tired and burnt out and resentful, or more healed and more recovered. Um, this is important to me, particularly coming to this work as a survivor of state violence, as someone whose parents experienced incarceration and were targets of the war on drugs, and as someone who has been in long-term recovery for trauma for a long time. So in a moment, I'm going to kind of, share with you a video of me telling my own story, which was kind of served as the genesis for the one of the projects that I worked on starting in 2015, called Mass Story Lab. And Mass Story Lab, was this participatory community storytelling project that traveled to 13 cities across the country, that was about, creating these story lab events that were about a reckoning with the impact of incarceration and criminalization, by centering those who had experienced it as the narrators and the storytellers, and using stories as a way to begin to understand what justice could really look like, what justice should look like through the lens of those who had experienced this violence, and bringing, communities into that process. And so, so Mass Story Lab traveled to 13 cities, but as I was, doing these Story Lab events in different cities, it became really important to think about how I was really facilitating a space that protected, that cared for, that supported the storytellers and the process, so that they didn't feel exploited, so they didn't feel as if they had given more than they were getting, right? That there was just no sort of mutuality in the process, and that they always had choice and power to determine, what they wanted to share and how they wanted to share it. And that was important to me because I had been in their shoes, and because I knew the kind of harm that could happen in a process when we weren't centering care. So yeah, so I'm going to share a short video. It was a Pechakucha event that I participated in back in 2015. That was kind of at the beginning of when I was developing Mass Story Lab, and wasn't the first time that I had shared my own story, but was different for a number of reasons, which I'll talk about in a moment. But this was, probably one of the first times that I was telling my story, in which, in an audience of, I taught at NYU for 11 years. And this was the first time that I was sharing my story at NYU with professional colleagues, right? I had shared my story and community with my people, right? With other folks who had experienced criminalization and incarceration. And that felt comfortable, right? But it felt very different to share in this context. And I'll talk a bit more about what that was, but I was shaking in my boots as I did. I apologize in advance because there are no captions in this video. And what you'll see is just a series of images and my voice over those images. You should also know that some of the themes in the video include things around like mental health and homelessness, and also the war on drugs. So I'm going to share that. It's about 6 minutes, 7 minutes. And then, okay, make sure that I'm sharing my screen.
This has been really exciting to hear about everyone's work, so I'm excited to share. So I am a writer and a cultural worker, and founded this organization called Create Forward, where I deliver creative strategies for social change. I work with a range of organizations around the country, but at my core, I am a storyteller, and so I'm going to start with telling you all my own story. So, in high school, I was an All-American in track and field with dreams of running in the 2000 Olympics. This is my team. We had just won the indoor national championships. We had broke a relay record, a record that stood for about 10 years. I was also ranked third in the country in the half mile. And that got me a full track scholarship to the University of Texas, which was like the #1 ranked program in the country at that time in 1998. And so I was on my way to achieving my dream of being an Olympic athlete. But a year later, I had dropped out of school. I was homeless. I was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. And it's unclear, how does a promising young athlete, one of the best in the country, fall so quickly and so epically? To understand that, we'd have to take a trip back to the 1980s, right, when America was on its way to breaking some records of its own and becoming the #1 jailer in the world. To do so, the U.S. had to launch the war on drugs, right? So in 1986, President Reagan signed into law the first of 2 anti-drug acts, and about 9 months later, my parents and I would really understand the consequences of that, right? This is Reagan signing that first drug act. I actually used to live down the hall from Charles Rangel, so it's interesting to see him there. We never got to talk about what happened here, but on May 6, 1987, on my 7th birthday, my parents decided to take a fateful trip to Florida. Their addiction to drugs had already cost them jobs, homes, relationships, and drug trafficking would be another step down a very dark path we might never recover from. They told me that we were going to Disney World, but we were riding in this beat-up cargo van. It was empty in the back. I had sat in the passenger seat. The only luggage was my dad's suit jacket, and one pocket was a large stack of cash, and the other drugs. We never made it to Florida. We were pulled over on the interstate and arrested. I was patted down along with my Cabbage Patch doll, and my mother and I were put into a holding cell together. When you're in jail, so much time passes in this very dark, closed space that you don't know how long you've been there or when you'll get out. I spent my 7th birthday in a jail cell with my mother. Neither of us was a threat to public safety. What she needed was rehabilitative care. What I needed was a safe and secure home. But instead, the U.S. punishes the children of drug addicts. We punish children like me. That would not be the last time that I would watch my parents taken away in handcuffs. And I'm not alone in this experience. What we know now is that childhood traumas like parental incarceration can have a devastating impact on long-term health outcomes well into adulthood. So at 19, when I thought the worst was behind me, I was diagnosed with PTSD, anxiety, depression. I was embodying the long-term consequences of our country's failed war on drugs. But what remained true was the resilience I had always found in imagination and in storytelling. I became obsessed with using stories to transform our country's culture of punishment. Over the last 15 years, I've engaged in a number of experiments using storytelling to engage the public imagination. I worked with Blackout Arts, using art and poetry and stories to activate dialogue, calling hyper-incarceration into question in over 26 cities across the country. I traveled to places like Rwanda and Chiapas, Mexico, where the people's stories are centered at the center of justice-seeking practice to end genocide and the destruction of culture. I brought what I learned back to the US, applied it to my work in communities in Bushwick and jails like Rikers Island, working across the Gulf Coast with survivors of Katrina. And then I co-created this project called Spread Mass Love, which changed my life. After years of creating space for others to tell their stories, this was the first time I was really telling my own story. My creative partner Marlon Peterson and I created a platform for us to use the story for using stories to reveal the intersectional ways we experience the harm caused by mass incarceration. What I discovered through Spread Mass Love is that if we are to end our culture of punishment, we must center love and relationship. Using the technology of the circle, we make the exchange of stories a relational tool that repairs harm, disrupts assumptions about good and bad people, those who deserve punishment and those who deserve care. What I'm designing now is a model centering those directly impacted, extending out to larger and larger concentric circles of people committed to justice and healing. By intentionally deepening the relational aspect of the storytelling process, I believe we can create sustainable change, transform our culture of punishment, ensure that efforts to decarcerate America really stick because they are rooted in new values and practices. So here's my mission. I plan to bring this dialogic model of storytelling to about 20 cities over the next 2 years with really incredible national partners, Just Leadership USA, the States of Incarceration exhibit through the Humanities Action Lab, a public memory project, and train over 1,000 people directly impacted. This is a design challenge of a lifetime for me. How might we design generative, layered, and concentric circles of storytelling to create cultural change? Does the exchange of stories generate the agency necessary to shift the culture of punishment? Can we clear the stubborn and tangled roots of punishment culture before they strangle us all? I have to believe it's possible. I have to because that's my nephew. And for his sake, I need to make sure that that flag on his hoodie little back becomes a symbol of opportunity and not a straitjacket strangling his potential, guaranteeing his entry into a prison cell.
So yeah, so that was, as I said, not the first time that I had ever shared my own story, but it was, a particular audience that made the difference. And so the context really does matter, there's a lot at stake. Like I'm in front of, professional colleagues, right, who, I've never sort of had more than a passing sort of conversation with, and I'm now suddenly revealing these really vulnerable things about myself. And I realized that is also really true for all of us, right? The context in which we are required to tell our story, who has power in the room, right? What the potential consequences are. Make a huge difference, whether that is you are telling your story to a social worker who is going to be deciding whether or not you keep your child or you receive the benefits that you need to be able to sustain yourself, or in front of a judge or a lawyer, or in front of an audience of people that you don't know who might potentially judge you. And so, having that level of awareness is really challenging me to think about how do I create practices both for myself and for my storytellers to ensure that they feel supported and cared for in the process. So I was like, as you can hear, my voice was sort of shaking, and I'm a trained performer, right? I stand in front of audiences all the time, right? And yet, and this was a very small group of people, and yet I was like, so, and could feel the cortisol running through my system, the sort of survival energy just sort of taking over, and it took everything in me, right? And chest kind of compressed, unable to sort of draw a full breath, all of that, right? So having that awareness, helped me to empathize. And I think that for all of you, I really want to encourage you to think about what your own experiences when it comes to sharing stories, and in order to build more empathy as you think about the people that you work with. And so we won't have time to sort of dig into this because I want to make sure that I get to the practices and potentially share, give you a chance to sort of reflect. But just a thing that I want you to sort of exercise that I want you to kind of take with you on your own time, is to think about a time when you were asked to share a painful story. What was the context, the audience, and the power dynamic in that audience? How did it feel? What were the emotions, the sensations? Did you feel like you had a choice, right? So often, particularly targeted groups, racialized groups, people who have experienced the state control, understand that they don't have a choice when it comes to telling their story, right? That the telling of that story is the difference between whether or not they get what they need to survive. So, did you have a choice? Did you feel like you had a choice? And how do you care? How did you care for yourself? And what helped you to recover? Right. So, thinking about that is this is a good kind of reflection as a starting place to help you think about what are the questions that I should be asking of the people that I work with, as well. And how can I empathize with the experience that they're having? So there's a series of things that, of practices that have been sort of essential to my work. As I mentioned, long-term recovery from trauma. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about trauma and learning about the neurobiology of trauma. And somatic practice is something that I bring into my work, with the groups that I work with, in a range of setting as a coach and as a facilitator. And so I'm always starting with the body. And so I'm going to just share with you a series of practices that I think could be really useful. And then I'll create some space for some questions and some discussion. So the first is around getting grounded, right? So notice sensations, notice your surroundings, notice the quality of breath. I'm sharing some slides right now, but there are no visuals on the slides. It's just some dark letters over a lighter background. And I'm reading through everything that's on the slide. So get grounded, that starts with noticing your sensations and in using neutral language to notice those sensations. So instead of making a story about what's happening in the body, just sort of just being like using words like temperature, pressure, movement, sort of floatiness, right? Void. Also helps to notice your surroundings, pointing out things in the room around you that you can see, and then noticing the quality of your breath. And again, this is just noticing without needing to fix anything or change anything. Because what we resist persists. And so if you're the kind of person who, is a fixer and wants to make things better, that this really is an invitation to both for yourself and for your folks to just really be present with what is without judgment. And then connected to that is around normalizing the experience, right? So often there is so much shame that we hold in how we've reacted, how we're reacting in this moment. It's like, oh, well, this is past. I don't know why I'm still so upset about it, right? But for the body, it's not past. Trauma is not responsive to time or place. As far as the body is concerned, it's still happening. It's happened right now. Doesn't matter if the thing that you experienced was 30 years ago. So you want to stay curious without judgment, right? So again, staying out of the story, and just staying really in the present of what it is that you're experiencing right now, and what information is offering to you right now about what's happening in your body. So noticing instead of resisting or trying to fix. And again, without judgment. There's already a ton of shame that can show up for anyone who is particularly sharing an experience of harm that they've experienced, whether it's at the hands of a state or at the hands of someone that they know. So practicing non-judgment can be really, really key. And a part of how we can do that is just being like, you're doing really great. What do you want to do right now to take care of yourself? You want to wrap your arms around your body and rock? Great. Let's just do that. I'm just going to sit right here, make sure that you have the space to do that. Right. So next is avoiding stigmatizing language. So using human first language and explaining technical terms, particularly if you work in a context in which there are lots of technical terms, right? Sometimes people don't feel like they have that they don't feel like they can ask those questions. So they'll just kind of nod along and pretend like they know what you're talking about. But just creating a space in which it's like they can ask questions, they can get information that they need. And particularly if it's in a context in like, a legal setting or other kind of clinical setting. And as much as possible, even if it's within even if the frameworks that you're working in require you to use stigmatizing language, how can you, whenever you're directly talking to that person, ensure that you are using human and people first language? Identify supporters. So who can be present during the session, who can be on call afterwards. So this is one of the things that we talk a lot about. With Mass Story Lab, I would meet with all the storytellers ahead of the event, and we talk about these things. We do a grounding practice together, and get people in their bodies, and we talk about like who can show up to you to this event. Is there someone that you could call afterwards? Who are the folks that support you? How can we support you, right, in that moment? And sometimes, when you have not had the space to have your needs met, figuring out what you need in that moment can be very difficult. And so what I found really helpful is to have some options, right? A menu of options, right? So it's like, okay, well, you don't know what you want. All right, well, or what you need, that's okay. Here's a menu of options. Do any of these things sound good? And if at any point you decide, you know what, that's actually not working for me, it's okay to change your mind. So the choice piece, yes, absolutely key. So support choice making. You get to decide how and when to tell your story. You get to change your mind at any moment. One of the things I always say to people when I'm coaching them or helping them prepare to tell their story is tell the story that you own, not the story that still owns you. And what I mean by that is like, there are stories that I'm just not ready to tell yet. I'm not ready to tell because there's so much shame, there's so much fear, there's so much, whenever I try to tell it, I just, go find myself sort of pulled back into a survival response. I'm not ready to tell that story. That story takes over the minute I try to open my mouth, right? So what are the stories that you own? What are the stories that you can tell this story and you can tell it while you are still present in the present moment, and you can still see the people in front of you, and you have not disappeared, right, into the past. So tell that story, and it's okay not to tell the stories that you're not ready to tell. The other piece of this that is really important, I'll often ask people is like, so let's talk about what happens when you tell this story. So what do you want to happen when you tell this story? I want people to, understand that I'm not a bad person, or I'm just as much a victim of the system, or whatever it is, right? But then you have to say, and what happens if you don't get that? Right? How are you going to feel if you don't get the response that you want when you tell that story? And if the answer is like devastated, or I don't know, then it's like, maybe we're not ready to go there yet, right? Like, so people have to also be prepared for the possibility that they may not get what they want when they tell that story. And they have to be okay with that. They have to be able to get up, walk away from that, and not be completely sort of destroyed by it. So the supporting of choice making, to really reflect on, you know, what your goal is and motivation is in telling the story is really, really critical. And you know, I'm one of the co-founders of the Rikers Public Memory Project. And one of the things that we talk a lot about is that, you know, our narrators, they own their stories. They never lose ownership of their story. If at any point you come to us and say, I no longer want my story in the archive, we will take it out, no questions asked, right? You always have the right to change your mind. And it's possible, right? It could be that, like, you know, years down the line, people are like, you know, I don't want to be defined by that experience anymore. I don't even want people to know about it. Take my story out of the archive, and that's okay. So supporting choice making, particularly, you know, when you haven't had choice, is really, really important. Create a care plan. So what can I do before, during, and after to support you in discharging energy and returning to the present moment? Um, and that could be so many things, right? It could be that, you know, during the session, I'm going to hold this one, you know, artifact that is from my ancestors that helps me to remain grounded. It could be that, you know, at the end of the, you know, the circle, we are going to come together and we're just going to breathe together so that we can co-regulate. It could be that I need to go off and sit in a quiet space as we transition, right? It could be that I'm not going to take any questions about what I've shared. It could be so many things, right? It could be that I just need to, you know, take a nap and eat a good meal. So what are the things that you need? For me, discharging energy always involves movement. So it involves probably going for a run, um, or some other kind of physical movement, um, and a body scan. Practice gratitude. So reflect on the experience and practice gratitude no matter the outcome. So coming together at the completion of the sharing, the gathering, and just honoring those who shared. And with Mass Story Lab in particular, and also with Rikers Memory Project, we incorporate gratitude throughout the process. And one of the ways that I incorporated gratitude in Mass Story Lab is through the use of this repeated refrain. And the repeated refrain was also an important part of how we built structure into the process. So at the end of each sharing, we'd pause, we'd breathe, and then we'd say, we hear you, we see you, we thank you for your story, right? And the repeated refrain can be an affirmation, it can be a generative transition. This was a generative transition. It was also kind of a reset in the process. So if you, you know, so it gave us all an opportunity to acknowledge the storyteller before we moved on. And it offered, it was something that you could expect to happen. Similar to, you know, the structure of a story itself, right? So a story has a beginning, middle, and end. So what are the ways you can build a structure that people can expect? They know what to expect at the beginning. They know what to expect at each transition point. And that sort of structure offers support and offered some guideposts and anchors that we can kind of, you know, lean on, particularly when we feel really, really overwhelmed in the process. So let me just look at the time. So those are the things I wanted to share. I want to now, we have about, you know, a little bit over 15 minutes left. I want to just pause for a moment and ask you to just notice the quality of your own breath. Notice any sensations that you're experiencing in your body right now. What is a question or a thought that's coming up for you as you reflect on what has been shared? We have about 15 minutes left. And so I'm going to just invite any questions or responses at this point. If you want to write your question in the chat, you can. Or if it's easier to speak your question, you can unmute yourself and speak. So there's a question: how does one balance reaching outside the comfort zone and respecting not yet being able to own your story? So, I think that there's a very fine line between stepping outside of our comfort zone, meaning sort of being on our growing edge, pushing ourselves, and um, respecting that we're not ready, right? So, what I'll often say is like the difference is that, you feel a little bit of discomfort and friction, but you are able to remain present. And you can tell that you're able to remain present because you can still be curious and you can still be sort of in the conversation, right? Versus being completely checked out and triggered, and you can feel that, right? You can feel the survival energy within you. You can feel that you can't sort of track what's happening in the room anymore because you're gone, right? Checked out. So that's the difference, right? If I'm not here anymore, then that's an indication that, okay, we're not ready to go there. But if I'm able to stay, kind of in the present and curious, and that when I've thought about the telling of that story, I'm clear that, what, no matter what people say in this room right now, I'm going to be fine. I'm going to be okay because I own this story. Then great. Then let's do it. Now it's worth it. And I think that it's also important to work with resistance. Sometimes resistance is good. Sometimes resistance to telling a story is good. Because there are some stories, particularly, if we come from communities that have been targeted, that we shouldn't tell because they are revealing aspects of our culture and our community that we should protect because they can be exploited, right? And so no, we shouldn't tell those stories. And that's also about the choice making as well. Okay. Yes, the recording will be available on YouTube. An example of human first language. I'm a person who has experienced homelessness versus homeless person, right? That's the difference. person, incarcerated person, right? Or person who's experienced incarceration. So though that's the difference, right? So not labeling someone based on this one particular experience, but always remembering that we are complex, full human beings, and that's just one thing that we might have experienced. I think there are some more specific examples, within legal context, within social work context, and I encourage you to think about within the context in which you work, what are the terms that are just stigmatizing that are at-risk youth, you know? There was a time when I would have been called an at-risk youth, right? So that's a stigmatizing term. That's not human first language. So there's tons of examples of that. Let's see. What else do we have? Love the framework of directly impact engaged witnesses. Do you have resources, thoughts about engaged witnesses and how to care for vicarious trauma through witness stories, obviously care for directly, right? Same thing. So the structure that we created, that I created for Mass Story Lab was also about caring for the engaged witnesses as well, right? So the structure also served as an anchor for them. So in between those story, each story is about 5 minutes. There's usually about 5 or 6 storytellers. We'd pause, we'd breathe, and then we would repeat the refrain. And that was a reset for the audience as well. Constantly checking in with people, asking them to sort of just notice what's coming up for them. Also asking them to sort of reflect with another audience member before they jump right into asking questions. So just things that help people bring themselves back in their body. And all of the things that I shared with you, all of those 6 strategies and practices that I share with you are things that anyone can do, no matter what part of the process you are, whether you are a listener, a narrator. With the Records Holding Memory Project, we do these transcription parties, and we have volunteers who are transcribing the narratives, and there's often a moment where they will pause and they will reflect together on what they heard and what it's bringing up for them. And so that's a way in which we deal with that. And also we're thinking about pace. How much is too much? Am I burnt out? I did Mass Story Lab for 3 years, and then I was burnt out. And I was like, it's time for me to stop because I can no longer hold this space with the same care that is required. So it's time to stop. Or it's time to, find other facilitators who can do this because I can't. Okay. Can you discuss a bit further the important distinction you made about stories that are important to healing and strengthening community, but should not be shared beyond those communities because they could be exploited, appropriated, capitalized on? I don't know what else to say about that. I mean, it's just true, right? I think that, let's think about research, right? When we have researchers who come in from outside of the community and they, are documenting the experiences of a group of people, and they never come back to share those findings. They use those findings to raise funds for their own initiatives, to write books, to build their own prestige. That happens all the time, right? We see this kind of exploitation. People build entire careers off of studying, documenting, researching groups of people that they never really are a part of, whose communities that they're not really a part of. So that's just a part of the work. It's also becomes a way in which some of the experiences become sort of boxed in, truncated, oversimplified, right? You know, some might say, I've heard, you know, indigenous folks say that like even the way that we now do land acknowledgements is really sort of oversimplifies what it means to truly be with the land and acknowledge the land that we're on, right? It's just sort of this performative thing in some ways. So I think, you know, so there's just so many examples of what this looks like. I'm trying to think of, there's a piece by a writer that I just recently came across, right, who writes about this in the context of um, her community, an indigenous community that she's a part of. But the name of the piece is not coming to me right now. So if I think of it, we're going to be putting together some resources to share with you all. I will include it. Let's see, what kind of physical spaces do you feel are conducive to sharing stories for supporting reflection and recovery? I have to say, you know, working from home the last 18 months has changed my life. It has really made it so much easier for me to care for myself. So, you know, using, you know, where the technology is readily available, being able to just be in your own space, you know, makes such a difference. You know, I've worked in prisons. I worked in prisons for 15 years, in prisons and jails. I worked in and out of Rikers Island, running programs. And, you know, I think it's less about the physical space and it's more about the people in the room and the space that you create with each other. It's about the quality of relationship more than it is about the physical space itself. Sometimes when I'm doing workshops, I will, especially now that I understand my own kind of neurodistinctness more, I've started to create sort of, you know, alternative spaces. Like if you need a quiet space, a dark space to go sit quietly by yourself in the middle of this session, here's the room over here, right? Like just thinking about what, you know, what are the ways that we can kind of create spaces for people to just care for themselves, right? Makes a huge difference. I don't have resources to doing this work, but you can reach out to us. You can reach out to Create Forward. I'll share a slide with our contact information in a moment. And then last, I'll just look at Sulu's question last. Any word to support people when they have reactions to caring facilitation? Have people get deeply upset by being offered a choice because they are reacting to times when they haven't been given that choice? Here's the fascinating contradiction around healing and recovery, is that so often we have not had the opportunity to be angry, right? Like it wasn't safe to be angry, right? In the moment, that when it's suddenly, you know, this space in which there is care, in which there is choice, in which people have apologized and acknowledged harm, now it's suddenly like we feel all the things that we weren't able to feel before. And sometimes that starts with anger. And that confuses the shit out of people because they're like, but I'm doing exactly what you asked me to do now, right? But it's like, but it hasn't been, you know, it hasn't been something that you've been allowed to experience up until now. And so just holding space for the anger, it's like, you're absolutely right. It's fucked up that we're only now asking you for what you want, right? That we never did that before, right? So just holding space for the anger. Because it's like, this is the first time that's like, finally, it's safe enough for me to just say, this is fucked up, that I've never had to feel this. One of the things that I also heard in a recovery group for family members of folks who are experiencing substance dependency is this this quote about forgiveness, that forgiveness is letting go of all hope for a better past. And I was like, shit, right? Right, like letting go of all hope for a better past. So I'm gonna end there. And close there and just share really quickly a slide so that you all know how to reach us. Where is it? So we can stay in touch. Here is the contact info. All right, so there's the writer's memory, there's me, there's my email, there's Mass Story Lab is not active anymore, but there's an entire archive of videos that you can check out on our website of all the stories that we collected. But thank you all for joining us. Take good care of yourselves. Hope that you will join us this afternoon for Free's workshop at 3, and then for our closing session, remembering ourselves free.